Everyone in the office feared the CEO Millionaire until the new cashier finally stood up to him. The CEO's name was Richard Vane. He was known throughout the city as a man who had turned a small family business into a giant empire. Yet despite his success, he was not admired by those who worked for him. Instead, he was dreaded. His presence alone made the office silent. People whispered about his ruthless decisions, about the way he fired employees without warning, and about the cold eyes that seemed to pierce right through anyone who dared to question him. The headquarters of Vane Enterprises was a tall glass building that shone like a mirror in the daylight. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Every desk was neat, not because people liked neatness but because they knew Richard would walk through the aisles checking every detail. One misplaced file could mean a sharp lecture in front of everyone, or worse, a note to human resources that could end a career. For years no one had the courage to stand against him. Managers obeyed. Supervisors kept their heads down. Assistants worked late hours even when sick because they feared the wrath of the man at the top. Richard enjoyed this control. To him, fear was power, and power was the only reason he had risen above others. Then came a small change that no one thought would matter. A new cashier was hired. Her name was Emily Hart. She was 24, fresh out of college and excited about her first job. She had grown up in a small town where people believed in fairness and honesty. Emily did not know the ways of big corporations. She did not know about the terror Richard cast over his staff. She only knew that she had a duty to do her work with integrity and to treat everyone with respect. On her very first day, she noticed the strange silence in the office whenever Richard passed by. She saw heads bow and heard keyboards clatter louder, as if people were trying to hide their fear in the sound of work. Emily found it odd, but she said nothing. She sat at her little desk near the accounting section and learned her tasks. She greeted people warmly, but most only gave her weak smiles, as if they were afraid even to be friendly. One afternoon she walked into the break room and found two senior clerks whispering. They stopped when they saw her. Emily asked if everything was all right. One of them shook his head and said quietly, "You will learn soon enough." The CEO does not like questions. It is safer not to speak. Emily frowned. She had never believed in silence in the face of wrong. Yet she decided to wait and see for herself. Her chance came faster than she expected. At the end of the week, Richard Vane himself walked into the accounting floor. He wore a sharp suit and his shoes clicked loudly on the polished tiles. Everyone straightened at once. Emily watched as people lowered their eyes. Richard glanced around like a king surveying his kingdom. He stopped near a junior accountant named David. David had been working long nights to finish reports. A single page was left on his desk slightly out of order. Richard picked it up and his voice boomed across the floor. "Sloppy work. Careless mind. Do you think my company can run on mistakes?" David stammered, trying to explain, but Richard cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Get out of my sight. If this happens again, you will not have a desk here." The room went cold. No one moved. No one breathed. Richard's eyes scanned the workers, daring anyone to challenge him. That was when Emily stood up. She did not know what gave her the courage. Perhaps it was the way David's hands shook. Perhaps it was the shame that covered the faces of her colleagues. Or perhaps it was her own belief that respect should never be crushed by fear. She stepped forward and said in a steady voice, "Sir, David has been working very hard. A single page out of order is not carelessness. It is the mark of a human being who has given his best." The floor froze. Heads turned toward her with disbelief. No one had ever spoken back to Richard in such a manner. Richard's eyes narrowed. "And who are you?" he asked. Emily answered calmly, "I am the new cashier. My name is Emily Hart." Richard's lips curved into a thin smile, though his eyes were still sharp. "So the new recruit thinks she can teach me how to run my company. Do you know who I am?" Emily nodded. "You are Richard Vane. You built this empire with your own will. But even an empire cannot stand if it crushes the people who hold it up." A murmur ran through the floor. Some gasped softly. Others hid their faces, afraid of what might come next. Richard's hand tightened around the paper he held. His voice dropped low. "You are brave, Miss Hart. But bravery has a price." Emily lifted her chin. "So does fear," she replied. The silence stretched. Everyone waited for the explosion. But to their surprise, Richard did not shout. He placed the paper back on David's desk. He stared at Emily for a long moment, as if measuring her strength. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed until the door closed behind him. The floor breathed again. David whispered, "Thank you, Emily." The others looked at her with awe. Some smiled for the first time in months. She had done what none of them dared to do. She had stood up to the CEO Millionaire. That night as Emily walked home she wondered what she had triggered. She knew Richard would not forget. A man like him never forgot challenges. Yet deep inside she felt no regret. She had spoken the truth and truth was worth any risk. The next morning the office buzzed with whispers. People asked if Emily would be fired. Some said she would not last the week. Yet when Richard appeared he did not mention the incident. He gave instructions as usual though his eyes seemed to linger on Emily now and then. Days passed. Emily continued her work diligently. She greeted everyone kindly and helped whenever she could. People began to gather around her desk during breaks. She listened to their worries and offered simple words of encouragement. Slowly the atmosphere shifted. It was as if her courage had lit a small flame inside the others. Still the shadow of Richard loomed. He was watching her. She knew it, and she knew that sooner or later there would be another test. Emily thought of her father's words when she left her hometown. He had said, "Stand tall in every place you go. Wealth can buy walls but it cannot buy respect." Remember that. She carried those words with her each day. And though she was only a cashier she believed her voice mattered. One voice could challenge fear. One voice could inspire many. And in the high glass tower of vain enterprises that single voice had just begun to shake the foundation of power. The days turned into weeks and the small act of defiance that Emily had shown grew into something larger. People in the office started to feel different. They no longer dropped their heads the moment Richard entered. They began to exchange looks and even small smiles when he passed. Fear was still there but it had been cracked by Emily's voice. Richard Vane noticed every shift. He was not a man who overlooked details. His empire had been built on control and he could sense when control began to slip. At first he thought of ignoring the cashier. A single worker was nothing in the structure he had built. Yet each morning when he entered the glass tower he saw the way people gathered near Emily. He saw the way laughter quietly returned to the halls. That was not just chance. That was influence. And influence was dangerous, if it did not belong to him. Richard began to test Emily. He would appear suddenly at her desk with papers demanding instant calculations. She answered with calm precision. He asked questions about invoices hoping to catch her unprepared. She met each question with steady knowledge. He even raised his voice once to see if she would break. She simply looked at him and replied with respect but without fear. The staff watched closely. Each time Emily stood her ground they felt stronger inside. David the junior accountant began to smile more often. The clerks who once whispered now spoke more freely. Even the managers seemed less stiff. The company was still under Richard's rule yet something invisible had shifted. One late evening Richard stood by the window of his office on the top floor. The city lights sparkled below. He had more wealth than he could ever spend yet for the first time he felt uneasy. He thought about the cashier with her quiet courage. She was unlike anyone he had met. Most people bent before him. She did not. She reminded him of a truth he had buried long ago. Years earlier when Richard was still young he had worked under a cruel employer. That man had mocked him, pushed him and told him he would never succeed. Richard had sworn that he would rise above everyone. He had sworn that he would never again be the one forced to bow. In chasing that vow he had become what he once hated. Emily's words about respect had stirred a memory he did not wish to face. The turning point came on a Friday morning. A shipment had gone wrong and a large sum was unaccounted for. The finance team scrambled to fix the numbers. Fear returned as people rushed with trembling hands knowing Richard would soon appear. At last he arrived, his face stern, his voice sharp. He demanded to know who had failed. One of the clerks broke down in tears saying the mistake was hers. She had misread the documents. Richard raised his hand and his voice thundered across the room. "You are incompetent. This company cannot survive on weaklings. Pack your things." Emily stepped forward again. She placed herself between Richard and the crying clerk. "Sir," she said firmly, "this woman has worked faithfully for years. She made one mistake under pressure. To throw her away for a single error is to waste her loyalty and her skill." Richard's jaw tightened. He looked around and saw dozens of eyes fixed on him. Not with blind fear anymore but with quiet expectation. They were waiting to see what he would do. Emily continued, "A company is not stone and steel. It is people. Without people you have nothing. If you choose fear you will always be alone. If you choose respect you will build something greater than wealth." The room held its breath. No one had ever spoken to Richard like this in front of everyone. At last Richard lowered his hand. His voice was lower now. "And what do you think I should do, cashier?" Emily looked him straight in the eyes. "Forgive the mistake. Teach instead of destroy. Lead instead of command. Richard stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the clerk and said, "Return to your desk. Learn from this and do not fail again." The clerk wiped her tears and whispered, "Thank you." The staff looked at Emily with gratitude. For the first time they saw the CEO bend not from weakness but from choice. Richard left the floor without another word. But that night he could not sleep. Emily's voice echoed in his mind. He thought of his own journey and of the way he had become a mirror of the man who once hurt him. Was this truly victory? Was this the empire he wanted? The next week Richard called a meeting of all staff in the main hall. Everyone gathered with tension. Some expected punishment for the defiance that had spread. Instead Richard stood on the stage and said words no one ever thought they would hear. "I built this company with iron and with fire. I believed fear was the only way to keep control. But I see now that I was wrong. Fear makes people silent. Respect makes them strong. From this day forward I will not rule you by fear. I will lead you with respect." The hall was stunned. Some thought they had misheard. Richard continued. "One voice reminded me of what I had forgotten. That voice was Emily Hart. She stood when no one else did. She reminded me that people are the foundation of every success." Emily sat quietly among the staff. She felt her cheeks grow warm as all eyes turned to her. Richard raised his hand. "Let her courage be an example. Let it be known that in this company every voice matters." Applause filled the hall. It was hesitant at first, then stronger until the sound echoed against the glass walls. From that day Vane Enterprises began to change. Rules softened. Managers listened more. Employees worked not from fear but from pride. Productivity rose, yet more important than numbers was the spirit that returned. People laughed in the break room. They greeted one another with genuine warmth. The glass tower no longer felt like a cage. As for Richard, he found a strange peace. He still demanded excellence, but he no longer crushed mistakes with cruelty. He learned to guide instead of strike. And though he never admitted it openly, he often looked toward Emily with respect. She had done what no board member, no investor and no rival could do. She had changed him. Emily herself remained humble. She continued her work as cashier, but she also became the heart of the company. People came to her for advice and comfort. She always said the same thing. Stand tall. Speak truth. Respect yourself and others. That was all she had ever done. Years later, when Emily moved on to new paths, people still spoke of her name in the glass tower. They said she was the one who taught the CEO Millionaire that even the mightiest leader must learn humility. They said she was the voice that broke the chains of fear. And Richard Vane himself would sometimes look out of his high office window, remembering the day a young cashier stood up to him. He would smile a small, rare smile and whisper to himself, "Respect is the true wealth." The empire he built no longer stood on fear. It stood on people. And it all began with one voice that dared to stand tall.